I'm Oscar, and I'm going to talk about managing application state, particularly in client-side single-page applications that we build as JavaScript developers. And I'm going to talk about why it's kind of hard sometimes to imagine what's exactly going on in your state of your applications, and as you build bigger and bigger apps, why they can become harder and harder to debug, and what are the ways some people are trying to solve this. So what do I mean by state? State is just the data you need to render UI correctly. Simply as that, whether it's data from the DB or fields you need on your front end. And I think to really frame like how we got to this problem of why single-page apps are hard to debug, I think it's helpful to look back at traditional MVC, and by that I mean like pre-Ajax, pre-single-page applications, where basically our model was our database, our views were our templates, and our controller was our server and our router, where basically you hit a certain URL on a page, your server said load this template with this data. And the great thing about this is there was a single model, and you could think of this as your database, and that contained all the ways you could display your data, and it was just one model. And there's also only one way to update this model, and this is why I'm making requests to update the database. But today we have single-page applications, and they're awesome, but sometimes it can hard to kind of figure out what's exactly going on in them. And what happened is, as we built as single-page applications, we brought MVC frameworks up into the client side, but it turns out it's a little bit different on the front end. We have multiple interconnected components that we kind of need to tie together, and it can become difficult. So, typical single-page apps have a lot of view components on a single page, and you need to kind of sync these up. And some of them might need data from the database, some of them may not. And right now, this is still pretty simple. But let's say I want to, show a user settings modal that I have hidden on my page. Where do I put that data that, whether or not I want to show that? And today we kind of end up creating a new model, a new place to store that data, whether or not to show that modal. What if I also have a loader that I want to show when data is loading asynchronously from the backend? That create another place to store that data. In Angular, you might put it on a scope variable or something like that. And you kind of end up with something kind of messy. How do I, even as your app gets really big, how do I make sure all my views are in sync? How do I make sure all my models are in sync? And it become kind of hard to reason about. So what's happened since we moved towards single-page applications? We lost a single place to store our state. There's many ways to change the state throughout your application. And it can become difficult to debug and possibly difficult for new developers to understand how everything works together. So Facebook itself experienced this problem, and you can think of how big their application is. So they started to think about ways how to fix this. So like, what do we do now? And their solution was a design pattern called Flux. And what this introduced was what they call unidirectional data flow. And I'll try to break that down a little bit more. But the important part is it started the way to move back a little bit towards where we were with traditional model view controller frameworks, where it kind of standardizes the way you update the state. Previously it was with database calls, and now it's views emit actions, and those actions update the state. So to go into that a little more. So like I said before, the views send an action, and I'll show some code examples. It'll become a little bit more clear. Actions are sent to the stores, and these you can think of these as container for data. And the store evaluates the new state, and then that state gets sent to the views. So yeah, like I said before, we're a little bit closer, but Flux allowed for multiple stores. So there's still not a single place to, like our database before, you could have multiple stores. So it was a little bit closer. And Flux is just a design pattern. It's not even code. There's no library at all. But it sparked a number of different popular libraries. And probably the biggest one is called Redux. This was created just last year by Dan Abramoff. And he wanted to bring a better debugging experience to React, specifically time travel debugging, which I might show in a bit. And it builds itself as a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. And it's tiny, it's just 99 lines. It's just building off of this Flux idea on how it works. So how is Redux different than a traditional Flux framework? It introduces a single store. So in Redux, you have one place where you store all your state, even simple things of whether or not you should show the user settings modal and things like that. It introduces a concept of action creators, and these just format the actions that your view sends. So when you click a button, I send an action, my action creator formats it in a way that what's called a reducer can read, and this reducers are just functions that take in state and an action and then return a new state. They're pretty simple in that way. So let's kind of see what that kind of looked like. So you guys all know Noodle. So here's one of the kind of the actions creators I have in here. So my view is actually calling toggle crawl when I click the go button on the crawl part of my web page. And you can see this is all it does. It just returns an object with a type and saying, this is the action I want to do. This action then goes over to my reducer, which is right here. And that just, in this case, I'm just inverting the last value that it was. And again, it just returns an object, which you can think of the state of the application. With if there was results, these are my search results, and whether or not my application is crawling. And this is like a debugging tool for React and Redux. And you can see how the state kind of changes. So here I toggled it. So you can see that this is a brand new state. And now I am actually crawling. And this is a good illustration of kind of like how Redux lets you debug your application easily. So you can actually toggle that on and off without actually interacting with your application. And this can become very powerful as you are, my server is down. Yeah, so Redux kind of brings a few benefits. It's declarative. It kind of declares there's only one way. You have to follow this path to update the state of your application. You have to send this action. The action gets formatted. It goes to the reducer, returns a new state, and it tells the views to re-render with that state. It's a single immutable state, as I said before. State changes are separated from the views, which has a ton of benefits for modularity and things like that. And I think it makes applications easier to think about, test, and debug. Cons, there's a lot of boilerplate. You do kind of have to edit a lot of files. But it's not unlike things we've done with Angular and things like that. And the cons, it's still difficult to build applications. Redux is tiny. It doesn't do a lot of things for you. So you still got to plug in a ton of libraries to make it work. the way you want. Yeah, that's all.